was ashamed of me. I met him when I was 25, working double shifts at a community health clinic in Baltimore and taking night classes to finish my nursing degree. He was 27, charming in that careful way some men have when they're still figuring out who they want to become. His name was Trevor, and he worked in sales at a pharmaceutical company, the kind of position that sounded more impressive than it paid. He wore good suits that I later learned he bought on credit, and he had a laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Before we dive in, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far our community reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Your support truly helps this community grow. Thank you for being here. We got married 8 months after we met in a small ceremony at my aunt's church. My family came, all of them, filling 3 rows with their Sunday best and genuine happiness. His family sent a card. His mother had called 2 days before to say she couldn't make the trip from Connecticut, something about her back, and his father didn't speak to him anymore for reasons Trevor never fully explained. I remember thinking it didn't matter. I remember thinking we were building something new, something that belonged just to us. The apartment we moved into was mine, a 1-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, but had good bones and neighbors who looked out for each other. Trevor said it was temporary, that we'd move somewhere better once he got his promotion. I didn't mind. I'd grown up in places like this, where people shared what they had and knew your name. The rent was cheap enough that I could keep saving, keep helping my youngest brother with his tuition, keep sending money home when Mama's hours got cut at the nursing home where she worked. Trevor started staying late at the office 6 months into our marriage. He said it was important, that his boss was finally noticing him, that he needed to be visible if he wanted to move up. I understood. I'd worked enough jobs to know that getting ahead meant sacrifice. So I made dinner and put his plate in the oven, and I fell asleep on the couch waiting. And I woke up alone more mornings than not because he'd leave before dawn to get to the gym before work. The first time he said something about where we lived, it was almost casual. We were getting ready to go to his company's holiday party, and I was wearing a dress I'd bought on sale, navy blue and simple, appropriate. He looked at me in the mirror and said, "You look nice, professional." Then he paused, adjusting his tie. "Don't mention the apartment if anyone asks where we live. Just say we're in the city." I didn't say anything. I finished my makeup and we went to the party, and I smiled at his colleagues and made small talk about nothing. And when someone asked where we lived, I said we were in the city, just like he wanted. On the drive home, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "You were perfect tonight," he said. I looked out the window at the streets I'd known my whole life and wondered when they'd become something to hide. The comments got more frequent after that, small observations that felt like paper cuts. The car I drove was older, a reliable Honda I'd bought used and maintained carefully. But Trevor started parking it a block away when we went to restaurants in certain neighborhoods. He stopped inviting me to work events unless they were mandatory, and when I asked why, he said he didn't want me to be bored, that I wouldn't know anyone anyway. When my brother called and I talked to him in the kitchen, Trevor would wait until I hung up and then say something about how my family always needed something, always had some crisis that required money we didn't have to spare, but we did have money to spare. I was working full-time by then, had gotten a position at a hospital with better pay and benefits. I paid the rent, bought the groceries, covered the utilities. Trevor's salary was supposed to go towards savings, toward the house he talked about wanting, the life he said we were building. But his credit card bills kept coming, and he kept saying he needed to look a certain way for work, that image mattered in sales, that I didn't understand how his industry worked. I didn't argue. I'd been raised to believe that marriage meant partnership, that you supported each other through the difficult seasons and trusted that balance would come. My parents had struggled, had worked themselves gray to give us what we needed, and they'd done it together. I thought Trevor and I were doing the same thing. I thought the struggle was temporary. There were mornings when I'd wake up before my alarm, the room still dark, and I'd lie there listening to Trevor breathe beside me. and I'd think about the distance between our bodies, even though we were only inches apart. He'd started sleeping on the very edge of the bed, as far from me as the mattress would allow, and sometimes I'd reach out in my sleep and find only empty space, cool sheets where warmth should have been. I'd pull my hand back and tuck it under my pillow and remind myself that people went through phases, that closeness ebbed and flowed in any marriage, that I needed to be patient. In the bathroom, getting ready for work, I'd catch glimpses of us in the mirror, me with my scrubs already on, practical and wrinkled from the laundry basket. Trevor in his boxer briefs examining his reflection from different angles, sucking in his stomach, turning to check his profile. He'd started going to the gym 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day, and his body had changed, become leaner and harder, more angular. When I complimented him on it, he'd shrug and say something about discipline, about how easy it was when you made it a priority, and I'd hear the implied criticism even though he never said it directly. The kitchen in the mornings became a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. I'd make coffee and he'd wait until I'd poured mine before coming in to pour his. I'd make toast and he'd say he wasn't hungry, that he'd grab something at work, even though I knew he wouldn't, that he was tracking calories with an app on his phone, that he'd started weighing himself twice a day and recording the numbers in a spreadsheet. When I asked if he was okay, if maybe he was taking the fitness thing too far, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Some of us care about how we present ourselves." I stopped asking after that. I finished my toast, standing by the sink, rinsed my plate, grabbed my bag, and left for work while he was still in the shower. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes through morning traffic, and I'd use that time to adjust, to shift from wife to nurse, to put on the version of myself that was competent and needed and good at what I did. By the time I parked and walked through the automatic doors into the bright fluorescent lobby, I could almost forget the tightness in my chest, the small voice that kept asking what I'd done wrong. The hospital was where I felt most like myself. I worked on a medical surgical unit, 12-hour shifts that left me exhausted but satisfied, surrounded by people who depended on me, who trusted me, who saw value in what I did. My patients were mostly elderly, recovering from surgeries or managing chronic conditions, and they'd tell me about their lives, their families, their regrets, and small joys. I'd check their vitals and adjust their medications, and hold their hands when they were frightened, and they'd thank me with a sincerity that felt like oxygen after holding my breath. Mrs. Patterson in room 312 was recovering from a hip replacement. A tiny woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. She'd grab my wrist when I came to check on her and say, "You're a good one, baby. I can tell. You got that light in you, the kind that don't go out." I'd smile and deflect, tell her she was the strong one, that she was doing so well with her recovery. But sometimes at night, lying in bed next to Trevor's turned back, I'd think about her words and wonder where that light had gone, if maybe it had dimmed without me noticing. The second year was harder. Trevor got a promotion that came with a title but barely more money, and suddenly he was traveling twice a month, going to conferences and training sessions that took him to cities where he stayed in hotels I couldn't imagine affording. He started talking differently, using words like networking and personal brand. And when he came home, he seemed restless, like our apartment was too small to contain whatever version of himself he was becoming. The night before one of his trips, I stayed up late finishing. Laundry, folding his clothes carefully, making sure he had everything he needed. He was already in bed, scrolling through his phone, the blue light casting shadows across his face. I brought his suitcase into the bedroom and started packing, organizing things the way he liked, rolling his shirts to save space, tucking his socks into the corners. "You don't have to do that," he said without looking up. "I don't mind," I said. "I want to help." He was quiet for a moment, still scrolling, and then he said, "Monica offered to help me prepare for the presentation tomorrow. She's really good at that stuff. Strategic thinking, you know, understanding what executives want to hear." I paused with one of his shirts in my hands, the fabric soft and expensive, something I'd saved for weeks to buy him for his birthday. "That's nice of her," I managed. Yeah. He finally looked up, met my eyes for a second before glancing back at his phone. She just gets it, you know, the corporate world. How to play the game. I finished packing in silence, zipped the suitcase, and left it by the bedroom door. Trevor was asleep by the time I came back from brushing my teeth, or pretending to be asleep, his breathing steady and even in a way that felt deliberate. I lay down on my side of the bed, on the very edge now too, matching his posture, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark and wondered when we'd started speaking to each other in implications instead of words. Monica became a fixture in our conversations after that, or rather in Trevor's monologues about work. Monica thought this, Monica suggested that. Monica had introduced him to someone important. Monica understood the industry in ways that were just so valuable. He never said anything inappropriate, never gave me reason to accuse him of anything concrete, but she was there constantly, a presence in our marriage even when she was physically absent. I suggested we look for a new place one Sunday afternoon, thinking maybe a change of environment would help. Maybe if we had more space, if we lived somewhere that felt more like the future he kept talking about, things would improve. We were sitting on the couch, me reading a book, him on his laptop, and I brought it up casually, mentioned that I'd been saving and we could probably afford something nicer now. Trevor looked at me for a long moment, his expression flat and assessing. With what you make, where exactly do you think we can go? The sentence hung between us, sharp and specific. I felt something shift in my chest, a small door closing. But I smiled and said we could wait, that there was no rush, and he nodded and went back to his laptop, and we never talked about it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to Trevor's breathing, feeling the weight of unsaid things pressing down on my chest, making it hard to draw full breaths. I thought about the girl I'd been when we met, confident and hopeful, certain that love was enough, that effort would be rewarded. I thought about the woman I was becoming, smaller and quieter, always apologizing for things that weren't my fault, always trying to anticipate his needs before he could criticize their absence. I got up carefully, trying not to wake him, and went to the bathroom. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the tub in the dark, my hands pressed against my face, and I cried as silently as I could, the kind of crying that shakes your shoulders but makes no sound. When I was finished, I washed my face with cold water and looked at myself in the mirror, the streetlight from outside casting strange shadows across my features. I looked tired. I looked older than 27. I looked like someone I didn't quite recognize. My family noticed before I did, or maybe they noticed, and I ignored the signs because admitting them felt like admitting failure. My brother James came by the apartment one Sunday when Trevor was traveling, and we sat on the couch, eating takeout and watching a game. During a commercial, James muted the TV and said, "You doing okay, sis?" I said I was fine, that work was busy but good, that everything was normal. James looked at me the way he used to when we were kids, and I'd try to hide that something was wrong, patient and unconvinced. "You seem tired," he said, "like more than work tired." I told him I was just adjusting, that marriage took effort, that Trevor and I were finding our rhythm. James nodded slowly, but he didn't look persuaded. He stayed quiet for a while, watching me instead of the game, and finally he said, "You remember when we were kids and you broke your arm falling off that swing?" I smiled despite myself. "You carried me 6 blocks to the hospital." "You didn't cry once," he said. "Not once. You just kept saying you were fine, that it didn't hurt that bad, even though your arm was clearly broken. Mama said you were the toughest kid she'd ever seen." He paused, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "But you know what she told me later? She said being tough doesn't mean pretending things don't hurt. It means admitting they hurt and dealing with them anyway." I looked away, focusing on the TV even though the sound was still muted, watching players move across the screen in silence. "I'm not pretending anything hurts," I said quietly. "Okay," James said. He didn't push, didn't argue, just reached over and squeezed my shoulder. Before he left, he hugged me longer than usual and said, "You know you can call me, right? Anytime. For anything." I said I knew, and I meant it, but I also knew I wouldn't call. Whatever was happening in my marriage felt private, something I needed to figure out on my own. I'd made a commitment, and I believed in keeping promises, even when they got heavy. Trevor started criticizing things that had never bothered him before. The way I dressed was too casual, too plain, not the look wives of successful men had. He'd come home from work and find me in leggings and a sweatshirt, my hair pulled back, no makeup because I'd spent 12 hours on my feet at the hospital and I was tired. And he'd look at me with something like disappointment before heading to the bedroom to change. One evening, I made his favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, something that took hours to prepare but that his mother used to make and he'd always loved. I set the table carefully, used the nice plates we'd gotten as wedding gifts and never touched, lit a candle because I thought maybe we could have dinner together, really together. No phones or laptops or distractions. Trevor came home late, later than he'd said he would, and when he walked in and saw the setup, he paused. "What's all this?" "Dinner," I said, trying to sound light. "I thought we could eat together, catch up. It's been a while since we just sat and talked." He looked at the food, at the table, at me standing there in a dress I'd changed into specifically for this, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. "I already ate," he said. "Monica and I had a working dinner to prep for tomorrow's pitch." "Oh," I said. "You didn't mention that." "It came up last minute." He loosened his tie, glanced at his phone. "This looks nice, though. You should have texted me. I would have told you not to go to all this trouble." He walked past me toward the bedroom, already pulling up something on his phone, already moving on. I stood in the kitchen looking at the table I'd set, the food I'd made, the candle burning pointlessly in the center, and I felt something inside me crack, a hairline fracture that didn't break through but changed the structure nonetheless. I ate alone that night, sitting at the table I'd set for two, chewing mechanically and tasting nothing. When I was done, I packed up the leftovers, washed the dishes, blew out the candle. Trevor was already asleep when I came to bed, or pretending to be, and I lay down in the dark and thought about effort and reward and the growing distance between them. The food I cooked was fine, but nothing special, he'd say, not like what his colleagues' wives made for dinner parties I wasn't invited to anymore. My job was respectable but not impressive, not the kind of career that added value to his professional image. He never said these things directly, never sat me down and listed my inadequacies. Instead, he made observations, asked questions that felt like statements, left silences that I learned to fill with apologies and promises to do better. I started working more hours, picking up extra shifts, telling myself that if I could save more money, if I could help us get to the next level faster, then things would improve. The hospital was always short-staffed, always needed people willing to stay late or come in on days off, and I said yes more often than I should have. It was easier than being home, easier than sitting in our apartment feeling the weight of Trevor's dissatisfaction pressing down on everything. My coworker Shanice noticed. We'd been working the same unit for almost 2 years, and she had a way of seeing through the professional mask everyone wore at the hospital. We were charting at the nurses' station one night during a rare quiet moment, and she looked over at me and said, "Girl, when's the last time you took a day off?" "I don't know," I said, not looking up from my computer. "A few weeks ago, maybe." "Try 2 months," she said. I checked the schedule. "You've been here almost every single day for 2 months straight." I shrugged. "We can use the money." Shanice was quiet for a moment, and when I finally looked at her, her expression was concerned in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Money's good," she said carefully, "but you know what's better? Sleep and having a life, and not working yourself into the ground for reasons that maybe aren't about money at all." I wanted to argue to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come because she was right and we both knew it. I went back to my charting and she went back to hers, and we didn't talk about it again, but I felt the truth of what she'd said sitting heavy in my chest for the rest of the shift. I stopped calling my family as often because Trevor would sigh and leave the room when he heard me on the phone. My youngest brother William called one evening while I was making dinner, and I answered even though Trevor was home, even though I knew it would irritate him. William was in his last year of college, stressed about finals and job applications, and he just needed to talk, needed someone to listen while he worked through his anxiety. I listened, made encouraging sounds, gave advice when he asked for it, and all the while I was aware of Trevor in the living room, the TV volume getting progressively louder, the pointed way he was ignoring me. When William finally said he felt better and thanked me for listening, I told him I loved him and hung up, and Trevor immediately turned the TV down and said, "Must be nice to have that kind of time." "He's my brother," I said. "He needed to talk." "And I'm your husband," Trevor said, still looking at the TV. "But I guess family priorities work different in your house." I stood in the kitchen, the phone still in my hand, and I thought about all the times I dropped everything to listen to him, to support him, to be available whenever he needed me. I thought about the irony of him accusing me of misplaced priorities when I paid our rent, when I kept our home running, when I made myself invisible so he could shine. But I didn't say any of that. I just went back to making dinner, and Trevor went back to his show, and the moment passed like all the other moments, unresolved and heavy. I stopped seeing my friends because coordinating schedules was complicated, and Trevor didn't like when I made plans without checking with him first. My friend Keisha from nursing school called one Saturday morning to invite me to brunch, a group of girls from our program getting together to catch up, and I was about to say yes when Trevor looked up from his laptop and said, "This Saturday? I thought we were going to look at furniture." We hadn't discussed looking at furniture. We hadn't discussed doing anything together that weekend, but I told Keisha I couldn't make it, that something had come up, and after I hung up, Trevor went back to his laptop without mentioning furniture again. Later that afternoon, when I asked him when he wanted to go look at furniture, he said he was too busy, that we'd have to do it another time. Keisha stopped inviting me after the third time I canceled. When I ran into her at the hospital one day, she hugged me but kept the conversation short, professional, and I understood that I'd been categorized differently now, moved from close friend to acquaintance, someone who couldn't be counted on. I wanted to explain, to tell her it wasn't that I didn't want to see her, but the explanation felt too complicated, too revealing of things I wasn't ready to admit. I made myself smaller and quieter, and I told myself it was temporary, that we were just going through a rough patch, that love meant compromise. I stopped wearing things Trevor had commented on negatively. I stopped sharing stories from work because he'd zone out halfway through. I stopped asking him about his day because his answers had become so brief, they felt like dismissals. I learned to read his moods from the way he walked through the door, the set of his shoulders, the speed of his movements, and I adjusted accordingly, making myself accommodating and unobtrusive. The third year, Trevor stopped pretending. He came home late without explanation, sometimes not at all, texting me that he'd fallen asleep at a colleague's place after drinks, that it was too late to drive. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped touching me unless he wanted something. He looked at me the way you look at furniture you're tired of but too lazy to replace. There was a night, about 8 months before he asked for the divorce, when I woke up at 3 a.m. and realized I was alone. Trevor hadn't come home. His text had said he'd be late, but it was 3 a.m. and he still wasn't there. I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, my phone on the nightstand within reach, and I thought about calling him. But what would I say? Come home? Why aren't you here? Do you even want to be married anymore? I didn't call. I just lay there in the silence of our empty apartment, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the neighbor's TV faintly audible through the wall, a car alarm going off somewhere in the distance. I thought about Mrs. Patterson from the hospital, about her 2 dead husbands and her 6 children, and the way she'd looked at me with such certainty when she said I had a light that wouldn't go out. I wondered if she'd be disappointed to see me, now lying alone in the dark, afraid to call my own husband, afraid of the answer I might get. Trevor came home at 5:30 that morning, just as the sky was starting to lighten. I heard his key in the lock, heard him moving quietly through the apartment, trying not to wake me even though I'd been awake all night. He slipped into bed smelling like alcohol and perfume, something floral and expensive that wasn't mine, and he fell asleep immediately, his breathing deep and even while I lay rigid beside him, my eyes burning, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. I got up at 6 for my shift, moved through my morning routine mechanically, and left without waking him. At work, I was professional and competent, checking vitals and administering medications and reassuring frightened patients, and no one would have known that inside I was falling apart, that every smile cost me something, that I was using every ounce of strength I had just to stay standing. I tried talking to him one night after dinner, asking if we could spend more time together, maybe take a weekend trip, reconnect. He was on his phone, scrolling through something that made his face glow blue in the dim kitchen light. He didn't look up. "We can't afford a trip right now," he said. I pointed out that we had savings, that I'd been setting money aside specifically for things like this. He finally looked at me and his expression was flat, almost bored. "Your savings," he said, "not ours. You keep track of everything so carefully, don't you? Every dollar, every sacrifice you make. You want me to be grateful?" The words hit like a slap, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they revealed what he actually thought, what he'd probably thought for a long time, that my contributions were somehow manipulative, that my effort was a form of control, that everything I'd done to support us was actually me keeping score, demanding payment. I didn't know what to say. The words felt designed to hurt, but they also felt like the truth of something that had been building for years, something I'd been refusing to see. I stood up and started clearing the dishes, my hands shaking slightly, and Trevor went back to his phone, and the silence in our apartment felt like a third person, heavy and permanent. I washed the dishes slowly, carefully, focusing on the warm water and the soap and the simple mechanical action of cleaning. Behind me, I could hear Trevor's phone, the small sounds of him typing, scrolling, engaging with a world that didn't include me. When I finished, I dried my hands and turned around, and he was already walking toward the bedroom, leaving his glass on the table for me to deal with, already dismissing me without a word. That night, I sat on the couch in the dark long after he'd gone to bed. I sat there thinking about the last 3 years, about all the small moments that had led to this, about the person I'd been and the person I'd become. I thought about my mother, who'd worked double shifts and raised 4 kids and buried a husband, and never once complained about the weight of it. I thought about my brothers, who called regularly even when I was too tired to talk, who showed up when I needed them, even when I said I was fine. And I thought about Trevor, this man I'd married, this man I'd supported and believed in and loved, and I realized with startling clarity that he didn't see me anymore, hadn't seen me in a long time. To him, I was a function, not a person. I was the one who paid rent and made food and kept things running while he focused on becoming whoever he thought he was supposed to be. And the worst part was that I'd let it happen. I'd made myself invisible, and he'd accepted my disappearance without question. 6 weeks later, he asked for a divorce. He didn't cry or apologize or try to explain. He just said he wasn't happy, hadn't been happy for a long time, that he'd met someone who understood him better, someone who matched where he was in life. Her name was Monica, and she worked in marketing at his company, and she came from the kind of family that had a house in the Hamptons and connections that mattered. I asked him if he'd been seeing her while we were still together. He didn't answer directly, just said that technically nothing had happened until after he'd made his decision to leave, as if the timeline mattered, as if intention was different from betrayal. He moved out that same week, packing his clothes and his laptop and the expensive watch I'd bought him for his birthday, the one I'd saved for months to afford. He left everything else, said I could keep it, that he didn't need reminders of a life he'd outgrown. Before he walked out the door for the last time, he turned and looked at me, and I thought maybe he'd say something, acknowledge what we'd had, even if it was broken. Instead, he said, "You'll be fine. You're good at surviving." Then he left, and I stood in the apartment that was suddenly too quiet, and I realized he was right. I was good at surviving. I'd been doing it our entire marriage. The weeks after Trevor left were strange and disorienting. The apartment felt different, bigger somehow now that it was just me. All the space he'd occupied suddenly empty and available. I'd come home from work and the silence would hit me immediately, total and complete. No TV sounds or phone conversations or movement in the other room. Just silence, and me, and the slow process of remembering how to exist alone. I cried more than I expected. Not for Trevor exactly, but for everything else. For the time I'd lost, for the person I'd become while trying to be enough for him, for the marriage I'd believed in even as it was disintegrating. I'd cry in the shower where no one could hear, let the water wash away the evidence, then dry off and go to bed, and wake up and do it all again. Work became my anchor. I'd go in for my shifts and lose myself in the routine, the familiar, rhythms of patient care, the concrete problems that had solutions. A patient needed pain medication, I could provide that. A family needed explanation about a diagnosis, I could offer that. Someone was frightened and alone, I could sit with them, hold their hand, be present in a way that mattered. Shanice brought me lunch one day during a shift, just showed up with 2 sandwiches from the deli down the street and said we were taking our break together. We sat in the break room, and she didn't ask questions, didn't push me to talk, just ate her sandwich and told me about her weekend, about her kids and her husband and the small dramas of regular life. When we were done eating, she crumpled up her wrapper and looked at me directly. "You're going to be okay," she said. It wasn't a question or a comfort, just a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. "How do you know?" I asked. She smiled, sad and knowing. "Because you're still here. You're still showing up, still doing the work, still taking care of people. That's how you know someone's going to make it. They keep going even when it's hard." The divorce was quick and cold, the kind of legal process that reduced 3 years of shared life to signatures on forms. Trevor wanted it done fast, probably so he could move on without complications, and I didn't fight him. I didn't want his money or his promises or his explanations. I just wanted it over. The morning of the divorce, I woke up before my alarm, the room still dark, the city quiet in that particular way it only gets in the early hours. I lay in bed for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just existing in that space between sleep and waking where things feel distant and manageable. I got up slowly, made coffee in the dark kitchen, stood by the window watching the street below start to wake up. A delivery truck pulled up to the bodega on the corner. A woman walked past with her dog. The traffic light changed from red to green and back again, mechanical and reliable, indifferent to the significance of the day. I showered and dried my hair and put on the black dress I'd chosen the night before. Simple and appropriate, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention. In the mirror, I looked older than 28, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, but I also looked steady, composed, like someone who could handle what needed to be handled. The drive to the courthouse was 20 minutes through morning traffic. I took surface streets instead of the highway, letting the stoplight slow me down, not rushing toward what came next. I passed the community clinic where I'd worked when Trevor and I met, the restaurant where we'd had our first date, the park where he'd proposed on a Sunday afternoon that had felt full of possibility. I thought about the girl I'd been then, 25 and hopeful and certain that love was enough. I thought about what I'd tell her if I could, though I wasn't sure what that would be. Don't do it? Be more careful? Protect yourself better? Or maybe just, this is going to hurt, but you'll survive it, and surviving will teach you something essential about who you are. I parked in the courthouse lot and sat in my car for a few minutes, my hands on the steering wheel, my breathing steady and controlled. Through the windshield, I could see other people coming and going, Lawyers with briefcases, families dressed in their best clothes, individuals moving through their own legal proceedings with varying degrees of composure. Everyone here was ending something, or beginning something, or stuck in the complicated space between. I got out of the car, locked it, walked toward the courthouse entrance. The air was cool and smelled like rain, and the trees were starting to turn, patches of red and gold against gray sky. October. The month of changes, of things ending so other things could begin. I wondered if I'd remember this day years from now, if it would feel as significant in retrospect as it did in the moment, or if it would fade into just another point on a timeline, notable but not defining. We met at the courthouse on a Thursday morning in October. The air was cool and smelled like rain, and the trees were starting to turn, patches of red and gold against gray sky. I wore a black dress and flats, simple and appropriate, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention. Trevor was already there when I arrived, standing near the entrance with his lawyer, wearing a suit I'd never seen before, probably bought for his new life. He glanced at me once, a quick assessment that felt more like confirmation than recognition, and then he turned back to his conversation. His lawyer was young and efficient, the type who smiled without warmth and had mastered the art of polite detachment. We went through the formalities in a small room that smelled like old paper and floor polish, signing where we were told to sign, initialing clauses that divided what little we'd accumulated together. The whole thing took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to undo what I'd thought would last forever. When it was finished, Trevor's lawyer shook our hands and left quickly, already on his phone before he cleared the doorway. Trevor stood up, adjusting his cuffs, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, might acknowledge that this mattered, even if only as an ending. Instead, he just nodded once, professionally, the way you might thank a waitress, and walked toward the exit. I watched him go, this man I'd loved and supported and believed in, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast, empty calm, like standing in a room after everyone's left and the echoes have faded. I was gathering my things, putting the divorce papers in my bag, when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The sound was deliberate, multiple people walking in sync, and something about the rhythm made me pause. The door opened, and my brothers walked in, all four of them: James, Elijah, Daniel, and William. They wore dark suits, simple and well-tailored, and they moved with a kind of quiet purpose that didn't need announcement. I hadn't called them, hadn't told them the exact date or time, but there they were, filling the small room with their presence, their faces calm and serious. James was the first one I saw, the oldest, the one who'd carried me 6 blocks when I broke my arm as a kid. He had our father's eyes, steady and assessing, the kind of gaze that made you feel seen and safe at the same time. He came to me first, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than necessary, his hand steady on my back. "We're taking you home," he said quietly, and I nodded against his shoulder because I didn't trust my voice. Elijah was beside him, quieter than James, but no less present. He'd always been the thoughtful one, the brother who'd sit with you in silence when words weren't enough. He picked up my bag without asking, his movements careful and deliberate, and I saw something in his expression that looked like controlled anger, though his face remained calm. Daniel stood near the door, the second youngest, with an easy confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. He'd been the protective one growing up, the brother who'd gotten into fights defending his siblings, who taught me how to throw a punch even though I'd never needed to use it. He held the door open now, his presence solid and reassuring. William was the baby of the family, though at 24 there was nothing childlike about him anymore. He stood beside me close enough that I could feel his presence like a wall, solid and unmovable. He'd always been the gentle one, the brother who'd read to me when I was sick, who'd taught me how to garden when I was sad. His hand found mine and squeezed once, briefly, a promise without words. We walked out of the courthouse together, me surrounded by my brothers, their bodies a fortress I hadn't known, I needed. They moved in sync, their strides matching, their attention focused outward in a way that suggested they'd done this kind of thing before, though I'd never asked what exactly they did for work, had never thought to question why they all seemed capable of showing up at a moment's notice, dressed impeccably, moving with purpose. Trevor was still in the parking lot, standing beside a car I didn't recognize, black and expensive and probably leased. He was on his phone, laughing at something, his back to us. He turned when he heard our footsteps, and his expression shifted when he saw us. Recognition followed by something that looked like confusion, maybe the beginning of unease. My brothers didn't acknowledge him, didn't look at him, didn't slow down, didn't alter their path. We walked past him like he was part of the landscape, unremarkable and easily forgotten. I saw him open his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe just reacting to being ignored so completely, but we were already moving beyond him toward a car I hadn't noticed when I arrived. It was black, large, parked at the far end of the lot where the trees created shadows even in midday. James opened the back door for me and I slid inside, the leather cool and smooth, the interior so quiet I could hear my own breathing. My brothers got in around me, James and Elijah in front, Daniel and William on either side in the back, and we pulled away from the courthouse, from Trevor, from the formal ending of everything I'd tried to build. No one spoke for a long time. We drove through the city, past neighborhoods I knew and streets I'd walked, everything familiar but somehow distant, like I was seeing it all for the first time. The radio was off, the windows were up. The only sound was the engine, smooth and expensive, and the occasional rustle of fabric when one of my brothers shifted position. I looked out the window at the passing scenery and thought about all the times I'd driven these same streets with. Trevor, back when we were first dating, when everything had felt possible. We get lost sometimes because he refused to use GPS, insisted he knew where he was going even when he clearly didn't, and I'd laugh and not mind because being lost with him felt like an adventure. Now those same streets felt like evidence of a different life, one I'd lived but barely recognized. Finally, William said, "You okay?" His voice was low, careful, the kind of question that gave me permission to be honest or to lie, whichever I needed. "I don't know," I said, and it was the truth. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything that had been inside me and left only the outline, the suggestion of a person. "You will be," Daniel said from my other side. It wasn't a comfort or a promise, just a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who'd seen enough to know. James caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "We should have come sooner," he said. "Should have said something." "I wouldn't have listened," I said, because it was true. If they'd tried to warn me, tried to intervene, I would have defended Trevor, would have insisted things weren't as bad as they looked, would have protected my marriage even as it was killing me slowly. "Still," James said, "we knew. We could see what was happening." "You showed up when it mattered," I said. "That's what counts." We didn't go to my apartment. Instead, we drove to a house I'd never seen before, a place outside the city where the roads got wider and the trees got thicker, where the houses sat back from the street behind gates and hedges. We pulled into a driveway that curved through landscaped grounds, stopped in front of a house that was large without being ostentatious, beautiful in a way that suggested permanence rather than display. "Where are we?" I asked, though I thought I knew or was beginning to understand. "Mama's," James said simply, getting out and opening my door. "She's waiting for you." The house was quiet inside, decorated with the kind of understated elegance that came from having taste rather than trying to prove something. Hardwood floors, soft rugs, furniture that looked comfortable and expensive without being showy. Photographs on the walls, family pictures I recognized from different stages of our lives, mixed with art that felt carefully chosen. My mother was in the kitchen, wearing an apron over her church clothes. pulling something out of the oven that smelled like home and memory and every Sunday dinner I'd ever had growing up. She looked up when we came in, and her face did something complicated, relief and sadness and love all tangled together. She put down the dish and came to me, her hands flour-dusted, her eyes bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not yet. "Baby girl," she said, pulling me close, and I let myself be held, let myself be small again, let myself break just a little in the safety of her arms. My brothers disappeared into other parts of the house, giving us space, their footsteps fading into distant rooms. My mother made me sit down at the kitchen table, the same kind of sturdy oak table we'd had when I was growing up, and she poured me tea and put food in front of me that I didn't think I could eat but somehow did. "How long have you had this house?" I asked, because I needed to ask something, needed to start understanding the shape of what I'd been missing. She sat down across from me, her hands wrapped around her own mug. "A while," she said. "Your brothers did well for themselves. Better than I knew, honestly. They wanted me comfortable, wanted to make sure I was taken care of." She paused, studying my face. "They've been worried about you, all of them. They wanted to step in, but I told them to wait, told them you needed to figure it out yourself first. Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out smaller than I intended, almost childlike. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and strong. "Because you were building your own life, baby. You were happy, or I thought you were, and I didn't want you feeling like you'd missed something, like you needed to worry about me. Your brothers, they handle things quietly. They always have." I thought about Trevor, about the apartment he'd been ashamed of, about the life he'd thought was beneath him, and I felt a strange, detached amusement at the irony. He'd left me because he thought I was poor, thought I came from nothing, thought I had nothing to offer his precious image and his precious career. He had no idea. No idea at all. But I didn't say that out loud. I just drank my tea and ate my mother's cooking and let the exhaustion of the last 3 years settle into my bones. "Tell me about the house," I said after a while. "How did this happen?" My mother smiled, the kind of smile that held stories. "Your brothers started doing well about 5 years ago. James first, then Elijah, then the younger two followed. They're good at what they do, whatever exactly that is. They don't talk about it much, and I don't ask, but they take care of things. Take care of me, take care of each other, and they've been wanting to take care of you, but you were married, and they respected that boundary." I thought about all the phone calls I'd cut short, all the invitations I'd declined, all the times I'd insisted everything was fine when my brothers had asked. They'd been waiting, watching, ready to step in but respecting my choices, trusting that I'd reach out if I needed them. "I should have called," I said. "You're here now," my mother said simply. "That's what matters." I stayed at the house for 2 weeks. My brothers came and went, their lives mysterious and busy in ways they didn't explain and I didn't ask about. They were kind without being invasive, present without being smothering. James brought me books, mysteries and thrillers and memoirs, stacking them on the nightstand in the guest room where I slept. He'd sit with me sometimes in the evenings, both of us reading in comfortable silence, and I'd remember being a kid and him helping me with homework, patient and thorough, never making me feel stupid when I didn't understand something. Elijah took me for walks through the property, showing me the gardens and the trees, pointing out birds and plants, his knowledge surprising and deep. He'd always been the quiet one, but on those walks he'd talk, sharing observations about nature and life and change, his voice steady and thoughtful. Once he said, "Trees lose their leaves every year, look dead all winter and then come back. They're stronger for it. The falling away makes room for new growth." He didn't say anything else, didn't make the metaphor explicit, but I understood. Daniel made me laugh with dry observations about nothing important. He'd comment on the absurdity of cable news, the ridiculousness of reality TV, the strange habits of the neighbor's cat who'd apparently made friends with a family of squirrels. His humor was gentle, never at anyone's expense, just pointing out the strangeness of regular life in a way that made it seem manageable. William just sat with me sometimes, comfortable with silence, letting me exist without needing me to perform recovery. He'd bring me tea without asking if I wanted it, appear with a blanket when the evening got cool, check that I'd eaten without making a big production of it. Once I thanked him for being so attentive, and he just shrugged and said, "That's what family does." My mother taught me how to garden, showed me the small greenhouse on the property where she grew herbs and vegetables year-round. We worked in the soil together, our hands dirty, our conversation drifting over easy topics that didn't require analysis. She told me about her life before she'd had us, about the dreams she'd had, and the ones she'd let go and the new ones she'd found. She talked about my father, who died when I was 17, his heart giving out suddenly one afternoon at work. "I was so angry at first," she said, her hands moving steadily through the soil, pulling weeds, making space for growth. Angry at him for leaving, angry at God for taking him, angry at myself for not seeing it coming, though how could I have? The doctors said it was quick, that he didn't suffer, and I was supposed to find comfort in that, but all I could think was that I didn't get to say goodbye. She paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a small smudge of dirt. But eventually the anger faded, and what was left was all the love, all the years we had together, all the ways he'd shaped our family. And I realized that endings don't erase what came before. The marriage still mattered, still meant something even though it ended, even though he was gone. I thought about Trevor, about our marriage, about whether it had meant something even though it failed. I didn't know yet. Maybe someday I would, but right now it just felt like loss, like time wasted, like a mistake I couldn't undo. As if reading my mind, my mother said, "Nothing you did was wasted, baby. You loved someone. You tried. You showed up every day and did your best. That matters, even when the other person can't see it, can't appreciate it. It still matters." Eventually, I went back to my apartment, not because I was ready, exactly, but because I needed to start the next part, whatever that was. My brothers drove me home, helped me carry in groceries they'd insisted on buying, checked the locks and the smoke detectors and anything else they could find to make sure I was safe. Before they left, James handed me a set of keys. "What are these?" I asked. "A car," he said. "Yours. It's in the garage downstairs. Something reliable." I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "It's not charity. It's family. Let us do this." I took the keys because I understood that refusing would hurt them, and because I was tired of refusing help out of pride. After they left, I went down to the garage and found a car that was new and practical, and exactly what I would have chosen for myself if I'd had the means. I sat in the driver's seat and cried for the first time since the divorce, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that I'd never been as alone as I'd felt. The months that followed were quiet and ordinary. I worked at the hospital, came home to my apartment, built a routine that belonged only to me. I started seeing my friends again, making plans without asking permission that was no longer required. Keisha accepted my apology for disappearing, understood without needing extensive explanation, welcomed me back into the group with warmth and without judgment. I took a pottery class on Tuesday evenings and discovered I was terrible at it, but enjoyed the mess and the focus it demanded. My pots were lopsided and my vases collapsed, but the instructor, an older woman named Ruth, with clay permanently embedded under her fingernails, said that was the point. "Nobody's good at first," she said. "You have to make bad pots before you can make good ones. You have to be willing to fail." I called my mother every Sunday and sometimes drove out to her house for dinner, sitting with my brothers around that oak table, sharing food and conversation, and the easy comfort of people who'd always been there, even when I hadn't noticed. I learned things about them during those dinners, small details that filled in the outlines of their lives. James was seeing someone, a woman named Angela who worked in education, though he was taking it slow, not rushing into anything serious. Elijah had bought a house nearby, was slowly renovating it himself, learning carpentry and plumbing through YouTube videos and patient determination. Daniel traveled constantly for work, sending postcards from cities I'd never been to, each one with a short message that made me smile. William had started volunteering at a community center, teaching kids how to garden, passing on the patience and care Mama had taught him. They asked about my life too, but gently, without prying. How was work? Was I sleeping okay? Had I talked to anyone, meaning a therapist, which I eventually did, finding a woman named Dr. Harris who let me work through the complicated feelings at my own pace, who never pushed me to forgive or forget or move on faster than I was ready. I didn't date. I didn't particularly want to. The idea of letting someone into my life again felt exhausting, like learning a language I'd already failed once. I was content with work and family and the slow process of remembering who I was when I wasn't trying to be enough for someone else. One evening, about a year after the divorce, I was at Mama's house for Sunday dinner, helping her prepare food while my brothers were in the living room watching a game. She was chopping vegetables and I was stirring a pot on the stove. And she said, without looking up from her cutting board, "You seem lighter now." "Lighter?" I asked. "Like you're not carrying as much weight," she said. "Like you can breathe easier." I thought about it, realized she was right. Something had shifted slowly and imperceptibly over the past months. The tightness in my chest had eased. The constant vigilance, the always monitoring my words and actions to avoid criticism, had faded. I could think about the future without dread, could make plans without anxiety, could exist in my own life without apologizing for space I took up. "I think I'm starting to remember who I am," I said. My mother smiled, finally looking up from her vegetables. "Good," she said. "She's someone worth remembering." 2 years passed like that, unremarkable and peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after pain has finally finished its work. I got promoted at the hospital, a position with more responsibility and better pay, recognition for work I'd been doing well all along. I moved to a bigger apartment in a better building, a place with hardwood floors and large windows that let in morning light. I bought furniture I liked, hung art I'd chosen myself, created a space that felt like home rather than compromise. The new apartment had a small balcony where I started growing herbs in pots, remembering what Mama had taught me about patience and care, about how living things needed attention but also space to grow on their own terms. I'd sit out there in the evenings after work, watering my plants, watching the sunset, feeling the satisfaction of building something slowly and carefully. I thought about Trevor sometimes, but distantly, the way you might think about a movie you saw years ago and barely remember. I wondered if he was happy, if Monica had been everything he'd needed, if his life had turned into whatever vision he'd been chasing. Mostly, though, I didn't wonder at all. He'd made his choice, and I'd made mine, and we were separate now, in ways that went deeper than legal documents. I ran into him on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was at a coffee shop near the hospital, standing in line during a rare break between shifts, when I heard a voice I recognized saying my name. I turned, and there he was, thinner than I remembered, wearing a suit that looked expensive but hung wrong, like he'd lost weight and hadn't adjusted his wardrobe. "Wow," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Long time. You look good." "Thank you," I said, polite and neutral, the way you'd respond to any acquaintance you hadn't seen in a while. He ordered a coffee, insisted on paying for mine too, a gesture that felt performative rather than generous. We stood awkwardly waiting for our drinks, and he filled the silence with updates I hadn't asked for. He'd left his old company, was working somewhere new, something about consulting that he explained with hand gestures and buzzwords that didn't clarify anything. Monica was fine. They were fine. Everything was fine in a way that sounded aggressively unconvincing. Our drinks arrived and we stood there holding them, neither of us moving toward the door or a table. trapped in the social obligation of this unexpected encounter. Trevor shifted his weight, glanced around the coffee shop, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "So, you're still at the hospital?" he asked. "I am. I got promoted, actually. I'm managing a unit now." "That's great," he said, nodding too much. "Really great. You always were good at that kind of thing. Taking care of people." The condescension in the statement was probably unintentional, but it landed anyway, a small reminder of how he'd always seen me. Reliable but limited. Good enough for certain things, but not others. I smiled blandly and sipped my coffee. "What about you?" I asked because it seemed required. "You said consulting?" He launched into another explanation, words tumbling over each other, about contracts and clients and opportunities that hadn't quite materialized yet but definitely would soon. He talked about money in vague terms, about deals that were almost closed, about his network and his potential and his plans. He sounded like someone trying to convince himself, voice pitched slightly too high, smile slightly too wide. I listened politely and offered the appropriate responses, and gradually I began to understand what I was seeing. Trevor wasn't fine. Whatever life he'd thought he was building had not turned out the way he'd planned. The confidence he'd worn like armor when he left me had worn thin, exposing something anxious and uncertain underneath. "Monica's family has been amazing," he said at one point, unprompted. "Super supportive. They really believe in me, you know? They're helping me get things off the ground." I nodded, recognizing the implication. He was dependent now, relying on his wife's family for support and opportunities, playing a role in someone else's world rather than building his own. The irony was sharp and obvious, but I didn't point it out. It didn't need saying. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation winding down into awkward pauses and false promises to stay in touch. Finally, Trevor checked his watch, an expensive piece that looked new, probably a gift from Monica's family, and said he had to run, meeting to get to, important people to see. Before he left, he looked at me one more time, and something in his expression shifted, became almost vulnerable. "You really do look good," he said again, quieter this time. "Like, genuinely happy. I'm glad." I didn't know if he meant it, but I chose to believe he did, chose to give him that small grace. "Thank you, Trevor. I hope you find what you're looking for." He nodded, smiled that strained smile again, and walked out of the coffee shop into the bright afternoon, disappearing into the crowd on the sidewalk. I watched him go, feeling nothing but a mild curiosity about how strange it was that this person had once been the center of my entire world. I finished my coffee slowly, standing by the window, watching people pass by on the street, all of them moving toward their own lives, their own struggles, their own versions of enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Daniel asking if I wanted to come to dinner on Sunday, and I smiled, typing out a quick yes, feeling grateful for brothers who checked in and mothers who fed you and lives that kept moving forward even after they broke. That night, I called James from my apartment, settling into my couch with a glass of wine and the comfortable certainty that he'd answer. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey sis, what's up?" "I saw Trevor today," I said, and I told him about the coffee shop, about the awkward conversation, about the strange sadness of seeing someone you used to love reduced to an uncomfortable acquaintance. James listened, without interrupting, the way he always did, letting me work through it out loud. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, surprised to realize I meant it completely. "I really am. It was just strange, you know, like seeing someone from a dream you barely remember." "That makes sense," James said. "He was part of your life, even if not a good part. It's okay to feel whatever you feel about that." We talked for a while longer, about nothing important, just the easy back and forth of people who knew each other well enough that silence was comfortable too. Before we hung up, James said, "You know we're proud of you, right? Not because of what happened or didn't happen with Trevor, but because of who you are. You're one of the strongest people I know." I felt my throat tighten, emotions I'd been holding carefully threatening to spill over. "Thank you," I managed, "for everything. For showing up at the courthouse, for always being there, for not making me feel like I had to explain or justify or be anything other than myself." "That's what family does," he said simply. "We show up, always." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, in the space I'd created for myself, and I thought about strength and family and the difference between the life you think you're supposed to want and the life that actually fits. I thought about Trevor and his expensive watch and his borrowed confidence, and I felt something like pity, but also like release. The final letting go of a weight I'd been carrying longer than I'd realized. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run, something I'd started doing in the months after the divorce, a way to clear my head and feel my body working, competent and whole. The air was cool and clean, the sun just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I ran through my neighborhood, past the church where I'd gotten married, past the old apartment building where I'd tried so hard to make someone else happy, past all the markers of a life I'd lived and learned from and finally left behind. When I got home, breathing hard and feeling strong, I showered and dressed for work, made coffee in my quiet kitchen, checked my phone for messages from friends and family who filled my life with steady, reliable love. I looked around my apartment at the furniture I'd chosen and the art I'd hung and the books on my shelves that reflected my interests rather than someone else's approval, and I felt something settle in my chest, solid and sure. I was 32 years old. I had work I was good at and people I loved and a life that belonged entirely to me. I'd been left by someone who'd thought I wasn't enough, who'd measured my worth in money and status and the right kind of image, and I'd survived it. More than survived it, I'd discovered that his measurement had never mattered at all, that the only opinion that counted was my own, and I'd learned, slowly and painfully, to value myself the way I'd always valued others. Sometimes at night, before I fell asleep, I thought about the girl I'd been at 25, so certain that love and effort would be enough, so willing to make herself smaller to fit someone else's vision. I felt tender toward her, protective, grateful that she'd endured what she needed to endure to become who I was now. I didn't regret the marriage, didn't regret the pain, because it had taught me something essential about resilience and worth and the quiet strength that comes from standing up after you've been knocked down. Trevor had left me because he thought I was poor, thought my family was nothing, thought I couldn't offer him the life he deserved. He'd been wrong about all of it, but not in the way he probably feared. My family wasn't nothing. They were successful and careful and strong in ways that didn't require announcement. My brothers had built lives that allowed them to take care of our mother, to show up when I needed them, to move through the world with quiet confidence that came from genuine achievement rather than borrowed status. But that wasn't the point. The point was that even if my family had been poor, even if I'd come from nothing and had nothing to offer but myself, I would have still been enough. My worth wasn't determined by money or connections or the right kind of background. It was inherent, unchangeable, mine to claim, regardless of anyone else's opinion. Trevor had taught me that lesson by taking it away, by making me feel small enough that I forgot I'd always been whole. And then my family had reminded me, not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through steady presence, through showing up at a courthouse and driving me home, through Sunday dinners and phone calls and the simple act of being there, always. Years passed. I kept working, kept growing, kept building a life that felt authentic and full. I dated occasionally, careful and selective, never in a hurry to repeat old mistakes. Some relationships lasted a few months, others faded quickly, and I was okay with all of it, comfortable with being alone until I met someone who added to my life rather than requiring me to subtract from myself. There was a man named David I saw for almost 6 months, a teacher at an elementary school who had kind eyes and a patient temperament. He was steady and thoughtful, and he never made me feel like I had to perform or prove anything. But eventually, I realized that what I felt for him was gratitude and comfort, not love, and it seemed unfair to both of us to continue something that wasn't going to deepen. We ended things gently, and he said he understood, and we meant it when we said we hoped the other found happiness. I heard about Trevor sometimes through the strange networks that connect people even after they've separated. I heard he'd divorced Monica after 3 years, that the consulting business had failed, that he'd moved back to Connecticut to work for his wife's father's company. I heard he'd remarried, someone his mother picked out, and that he seemed content in a life that had been arranged rather than chosen. The information reached me like news about a stranger, interesting in an abstract way but fundamentally unconnected to anything I cared about. My brothers continued to be mysterious and successful and present in exactly the ways I needed. James got married to Angela in a ceremony where I stood up with him and cried happy tears, watching him promise to love and honor someone who clearly loved and honored him back. It was the kind of wedding Trevor and I had never had, full of genuine emotion and mutual respect, and I felt no bitterness watching it, only happiness for my brother and hope that he'd found what I was still looking for. Elijah bought a house near our mother's, began the quiet process of settling into middle age with grace and humor. He'd finished his renovations, turned the house into something beautiful and personal, and sometimes on Sundays we'd all gather there instead of Mama's, sitting in his backyard around a fire pit he'd built himself, talking late into the evening about nothing important. Daniel continued to travel for work. I still didn't fully understand, but that seemed important and all-consuming. He'd show up unexpectedly sometimes, appearing at my apartment with takeout and stories about places he'd been, people he'd met, experiences that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary depending on how he told them. He had a gift for making the world seem both vast and manageable, full of possibility but not overwhelming. William, the youngest, stayed closest to home, checking on Mama daily, managing details none of us had to worry about because he'd already handled them. He'd expanded his work with the community center, had started a program teaching kids not just about gardening, but about patience and growth and the value of tending things carefully. He'd bring me photographs sometimes of the kids with their plants, their faces bright with pride over tomatoes they'd grown themselves. And I'd think about how the best gifts we give are often the simplest ones, the ones that teach rather than provide. At family dinners, sitting around that oak table, I sometimes caught my brothers looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite name, satisfaction maybe, or relief, or just the simple contentment of people who'd worried and then watched that worry prove unnecessary. They never brought up Trevor, never asked if I'd heard about his failures or felt vindicated by his struggles. They understood, I think, that revenge wasn't the point, had never been the point. The point was that I'd survived, that I'd found myself again after losing myself in someone else's vision, that I'd learned to stand steady in my own worth, regardless of who chose to recognize it or diminish it. That was the victory, quiet and private and completely my own. On the 5th anniversary of my divorce, I drove out to my mother's house for Sunday dinner, the way I did most weeks. The weather was beautiful, spring turning everything green and alive, the kind of day that felt like permission to hope. My brothers were all there, gathered in the kitchen helping Mama cook, their voices overlapping in familiar patterns of teasing and laughter. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. These men who'd shown up for me when I needed them, who'd never needed to be asked, who'd understood that sometimes love looked like presence, nothing more or less. Daniel noticed me first and grinned, waving me in with a spatula. "Come on, sis, you're on salad duty." I joined them in the kitchen, taking my place in the comfortable rhythm of family, chopping vegetables and listening to stories, and feeling the deep, abiding peace of being exactly where I belonged. Mama hummed while she stirred something on the stove. James argued with Elijah about sports. William set the table with careful precision. This was my life now, Not perfect, not without complications or challenges or moments of loneliness, but mine. Built by my choices, sustained by my strength, surrounded by people who'd never asked me to be anything other than myself. Trevor had tried to take that from me, had made me believe for a while that I wasn't enough, that my family wasn't enough, that the life I came from was something to hide. But he'd been wrong. Not because my family turned out to be wealthy or successful, though they were. Not because I'd become important or impressive by his standards, though I'd built a career I was proud of. He'd been wrong because worth isn't conditional, because enough is a decision, not a destination, because the only person who needed to believe in my value was me. We ate dinner together as the sun set, light slanting through the windows in golden bars, the food abundant and delicious, the conversation easy and full. After we finished, we moved to the living room. My brothers and I sprawled on couches, while Mama settled into her favorite chair, and we talked about nothing important, the kind of talk that fills spaces with warmth and connection. At some point, James asked me about work, and I told him about a new program I was developing, something about patient care coordination that I was excited about. He listened carefully, asked good questions, nodded with genuine interest. When I finished, he smiled and said, "You're really good at what you do, you know that?" I smiled back, feeling something warm and steady in my chest. "Yeah," I said, "I do know that." And I did. I knew my worth now, knew it in a way that didn't require external validation or approval. I'd learned it the hard way, through pain and loss and the slow rebuilding that follows endings. But I'd learned it thoroughly, permanently, in a way that couldn't be shaken by someone else's opinion or rejection. Trevor had left me because he thought I was poor, thought I wasn't enough, thought my family couldn't offer him what he deserved. On the day we divorced, my brothers came for me, not to prove him wrong, but to remind me who I'd always been, to show me that I'd never been alone, that worth wasn't something I needed to earn or justify. They'd taken me home, not to a place, but to a knowing, a certainty, a truth I'd temporarily forgotten. And in that homecoming, I'd found something more valuable than any revenge, any vindication, any dramatic proof of value. I'd found peace. I'd found myself. I'd found that being enough was simple, after all, once you stopped asking permission to believe it. The evening ended the way Sunday evenings always did, with hugs and promises to call during the week, with Mama pressing leftovers into my hands, with my brothers walking me to my car and waiting while I drove away. I watched them in my rearview mirror, standing together in the driveway, their figures growing smaller but never disappearing, completely, always there, solid and sure. I drove home through familiar streets, windows down, night air cool on my face, and I felt grateful for the journey, even the painful parts, even the parts that had broken me open so I could rebuild stronger. Trevor had been a chapter in my life, an important one maybe, but not the whole story. The whole story was bigger, fuller, richer than he'd ever imagined. The whole story was mine, and it was still being written, and I was enough to write it exactly as I was. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And before you go, click on Hype to help this video reach even more people. Your support keeps these voices alive and keeps our community growing.